Hello, everyone. This is Officer Cervantes. Welcome to today's media availability, December 7th, 2021. Thank you for joining us. Just a friendly reminder to raise your hand if you have a question. Chief, go ahead. You may begin.
Actually, I made a series of extensive remarks this morning on crime and on a series of some events that have happened over the last week involving follow home, follow off, smash and grabs, as well as a terrible and horrific double homicide and a shooting death of a 12-year-old young man and wounding of an innocent bystander, a 9-year-old girl. So with that, I'll really take questions from the panel.
Thank you, Chief. We will start with Ms. Stephanie Dazio. Go ahead with your question.
Thanks, Officer. Good afternoon, Chief. I was listening this morning to the Police Commission, but if you could go into a little bit more detail about the Wilmington shooting. You'd mentioned that about 100 bullets had been fired between that shooting and other shootings. Can you be a little bit more specific just about the Wilmington shooting itself? Thank you.
Well, it's an active investigation, and what I can say is that yesterday afternoon, just shortly before 5 o'clock, a 30-year-old woman who we believe to be the stepmother of the 12-year-old young man that was shot and killed was in an SUV along with a sibling that was in the back seat. And the group of the three of them were in this neighborhood, and somehow some type of encounter occurred with multiple individuals. We believe them to be males. Don't have an age description at this point, but as they're in the vehicle, numerous shots were fired from multiple handguns or multiple firearms. That was taken or consequence of the forensic investigation that we've followed up with, where we've got casings of different calibers. And the number of those casings, I'm not going to put out the exact number, but they were a substantial number between both guns. Both the mother was shot in the stomach, and the 12-year-old suffered a gunshot wound, I believe, to the head. They fled in an effort to get out of that area and get to a point of safety. And short distance away, summoned 911, and police responded, and we found them in the condition I've described. The life-saving efforts failed, and failed with this young man and this young boy, and he died. The mother is in stable condition. We also found a 9-year-old girl that was in the parking or the playground area, in the area where the shooting occurred. Our investigation has continued over the night and through today, and it will continue through tonight. South Bureau Homicide on scene, as well as Mayor's Crisis Response Team, to provide for this grieving family, as well as the community members. Our gang reduction, youth development, community intervention workers are also responded and are working with the neighborhood and with individuals throughout that community in an effort to both address the grieving as well as to address any further violence that's there. We have continued to have a uniform presence and will in the ensuring night and into tomorrow and the following days to ensure that that community is safe. There's efforts with the presence at the school this morning, at the elementary school in Wilmington, for grief counselors. We've worked with the administrators of LA Unified, as well as LA Unified School District Police, for non-scene presence, and also to help, again, reassure this public that the members of this community that you can be safe. There'll be safe passages, meaning those uniformed officers will be there through the evening. I want to thank that Councilmember Luciano, his district, has provided additional funding that has allowed us to augment our staffing in that area. In fact, those officers were working last night and were part of our investigative response to help us gather clues and collect information. I do believe that we will solve this case in concert with a combination of the amount of evidence and information that we're gathering, as well as the community's help and assistance. This community has been shocked by this terrible assault and senseless violence, and we are fully committed to work with them to identify those individuals responsible. And my message to those individuals is to step forward, take responsibility for your action, because this was a terrible, terrible loss of life, senseless, and they should step forward and again, understand that their actions require consequences.
Do you believe this was a targeted attack or random?
I'm not prepared to talk about the interactions between the vehicle and the woman that was driving it and our assailants. I think that we'll let this investigation continue to unfold before any of that comes out. I do believe that the amount of rounds that were fired is indicative that this was purposeful. This was a brazen assault in the middle of the day that whether it was targeted in a preemptive manner or a premeditated manner or spontaneous, I just know that the amount of violence was just, it's really, it just boggles your mind when you think about an afternoon outside of a school for two individuals at least, and with two different firearms, one a very powerful one by the nature of the casings we've recovered in the hands of these assailants. It's a terrible loss of life and senseless.
Is it fair to say that there were dozens of bullets fired? And then I'll let you go to my next colleague.
Yes, easily dozens.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you. Our next question will be from Dinora Perez. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, Chief. Thank you so much for taking our question. I know you talked about crime earlier, but we are wondering what is exactly being done to stop the rise in crime in the city. If you can go in detail of any kind of plan, because a lot of residents really want to feel at ease in their hometown, in their homes, in their neighborhoods.
So our work in regards to impacting violent crime, particularly, is to use and align every one of our investigative and uniform resources to that task, in concert to work in partnership with our interventionists and community workers, to work with our communities themselves and to quell further acts of violence. We're working with our federal partners and our other law enforcement partners to identify those that are supplying guns into these neighborhoods and to identify and prosecute them with federal and state charges to the fullest extent. We're working with our prosecutors to also more aggressively prosecute individuals who are possessing guns or using guns in the whether it be a robbery or other type of assault. And the efforts moving forward is to, at the same time, recognize that longstanding issues in these communities have allowed this type of violence to flourish. And so we're going to remain committed with our outreach and engagement in regards to community safety partnerships, our dedicated resources in the most troubled communities that are there to help build and rebuild those communities so that they can deter violence such as this, as well as continue with our engagement with footbeats and high uniform presence, not just to deter violence, but to reach out to members of our community and assure them that we're going to do all we can to protect them. And at the same time, we're alerting the public that these crimes that are occurring are real, that while we still are seeing crime rates that pale in comparison to perhaps 20 or 30 years ago, we've lost a substantial amount of ground when it comes to the number of homicides and shooting victims. And most troubling is that the rate of gun violence appears to be on the increase, and its representation both within aggravated assaults as well as robberies is evidence of that. And that's despite the fact that we're increasing the number of gun arrests that we're making, and we're trying to interrupt the flow of guns. So it's a difficult time. It's not unique to Los Angeles. These are phenomena. It's a phenomenon we're seeing in other parts of the country. It is interesting that as I look across the country, I do see even greater rates of increases in violent crime and shooting violence. But if I look outside the United States, this pandemic has not brought on this level of violence. And so I'm left with the fact of what is unique here that is perhaps different in other parts of the country or other parts of the world. And I think much of that is the culture of gun violence that we see with the ready supply of weapons, firearms, and the sense that there's just too many guns out there and they're readily available for people to access on a dispute or to exact their revenge or to strike out at someone over a trivial matter. But let me just close by saying that the increases we see here we can turn them back, and we will turn them back. And we'll turn them back by all of us collectively having the will to pay attention, not just to the 12-year-old that was killed, but the two men that were in a camper trailer and that were assaulted and shot and killed last night as well, just miles away from the killing of this young boy. And we've got the loss of life in that instance is as tragic as it is in all the other instances of gun violence. And we've got to remain committed to working with the police, to working with our neighbors, to being a voice that doesn't stand for this, and that is committed to providing whatever information they can to help identify those responsible and bring them before the criminal justice system, and also find ways to deter people from entering into this senseless violence. That's been our position regarding, particularly on the grab and goes or smash and grabs, is that we see in that there are some individuals that may be just in a copycat or taking the moment of seeing the greed of potentially overrunning a store and sconning away with high value merchandise, is that it's something that somehow they've rationalized in their mind that they'll not be caught, or that it's really not that big of a deal. And obviously it is. And it's one of those things that when you start having lawlessness in that sense, it's contagious. So our work with the community is for all of us to work together, vow not to have to acquiesce or to accept some level of this violence, and to commit ourselves to stopping it. And that includes schools, that includes the clergy, that includes families, neighbors. It's the entire society. It's not just police, and it's not just the criminal justice system that needs to weigh in here.
One follow-up question. You say that there is an increase in arrests with guns, and you may see an increase of being able to catch those with the smash and grab. But are we seeing also the conviction on these suspects? And are we seeing it enough that you would like, since you are doing all the hard work to try to get these suspects off the streets?
It's one of the areas that we're interested. The courts have been impacted by the pandemic. They've established a backlog of criminal cases. They've deferred trials for months at a time. Even today, with zero bail, people are arrested and their next court appearance is 4 or 5 months away. And these are for felonies as well as misdemeanor charges. We think, I am encouraged that most recently the criminal courts was a recipient of additional funding to allow them to restart, if you will, courts and start working through the backlog. Historically, 2 years ago, short 2 years ago, a person arrested for one of these offenses would be in custody subject to an arraignment within 72 hours, generally 2 days, depending on a holiday, so to speak. And they'd have an arraignment, and there would be an assessment by the judge with the defense attorney and prosecutor of whether or not the person would be remanded and remain in custody pending a preliminary hearing, which would be in a series of days. Today, that process is with a zero bail. The person is in and out, back in the community, and their next court appearance, if is an arraignment that is 4 or 5 months out. That individual is back in the street, and that works once or twice. But when you start continuing that week after week, month after month, and or we are able to get a bail enhancement and the person goes to an arraignment court with a bail enhancement because they're still in custody, so they get that speedy arraignment. But the judge or the decision of the criminal justice system, the bench, is to put the person back out on a zero bail. Then again, the person's back in the field, and there's that word travels to others. Lastly, if the person does bail out, but again, the next court date is 4 or 5 months away, then again, I think these are instances where, while many may not reoffend, we're seeing an increasing number that I believe that are reoffending because they're not seeing a consequence or a deterrent value of a threat of incarceration. So that's one aspect of this that needs to change. Another aspect of this is probation and parole. people that have been released from state prison and county jail that are on supervised, community supervised positions, we're finding are not facing prosecutions for what would otherwise be probation or parole violations. And again, when those circumstances occur, then the most chronic offender and the most repeat offender are going to take advantage of that system or be allowed to take advantage. So that's where you see these type of increases that I believe we're seeing today. So we're asking for the criminal justice system as we go through this pandemic to recognize the well-intended safeguards are also having an unintended impact on community safety. And we're hopeful that in addition to the 3.5% increase in violent crime arrests, that those prosecutions are going to be timely, which will act as a deterrent to the others that would be tempted to engage in similar conduct.
Thank you, Chief.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Our next question will be from Mr. Kevin Rector. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, Chief. I have a couple questions. First two, I think, are pretty quick. They are, can you describe with any more detail the injuries to the 9-year-old girl? And you mentioned 2 different weapons of different caliber and intimated that one of them might have been a pretty high caliber. Can you say what those caliber weapons are?
No, I cannot at this time. This is all part of the investigation, and I'll just reference it for the striking nature. More details will come out in the coming days in regards to what the exact calibers were. As far as the injuries to the young girl, I believe she was shot in the back, but I don't have any further on that. That briefing was from earlier this morning with me. I've not had a chance to get a further update.
Okay, and then my last question is, there's been a lot of attention paid of late to follow home robberies and smash and grab burglaries. And the reality on the ground is that a lot of this violent crime occurs in not those same wealthy neighborhoods, but in neighborhoods that have traditionally seen more violence. This shooting in Wilmington is tragic along those same lines. Can you speak to what you are doing? I know there's a task force about smash and grab, but can you speak a little bit more as to what the department is doing for the violent crime, the increase in homicides?
Sure. Our greatest deployment of resources, both uniform as well as investigative resources, are in the areas most impacted by violent crime, whether it be our homicide investigations, our shooting investigations, our gang details, our uniform patrols. All are geared towards the density, if you will, the concentration of violence. That's what our largest effort is, to deter that, recognizing that every corner of the city has to have some police coverage. So that's the prioritization that we've had and will continue to have, is on violence. Our FBI task force is an effort with local agencies. It springs from the south portion of the city and into the central portion. Those longstanding relationships and added resources are because of concentrations of violence in those areas. What we're seeing here today with the task force on follow home, follow off is that the hits are continuing. We had one this morning at the Intercontinental as 2 men waited for a Lyft or an Uber car. They were accosted and their target was a high expensive jewelry. And the day before, similarly on the west side, of an individual who happened to be a tourist from out of the city. Each of those encounters, physical assault was made. Gratefully, neither one were shot and killed, but the propensity for violence in the follow home, follow off is certainly there. And as witnessed by 2 homicides and a number of shooting victims, that's why the added number of resources dedicated to that task is because of the seriousness of those offenses. So I believe that our work will continue to be prioritized for violent crime first. But I have tried to say today and the last couple of days that while we're focusing on that, we're also focusing on the long-term efforts of building communities, building safer communities that have, if you will, an identity and ability to work with themselves, with the police, and with government agencies and NGOs to provide for a type of neighborhood where people feel safe walking to and from school, where people feel safe going out in their front yard and enjoying a Sunday evening. And that's where our community safety partnership efforts, that's where our senior leads and our efforts with footbeats and patrols over the course of the summer and into the fall, we've dedicated some of those some resources, finite resources, for those added activities, because we want to be balanced. It's not just a task force to identify and track down those people involved in violence. We also need to make sure that we have time and resources to talk with victims, but also to talk with neighbors who are troubled by this, and to work with them to how to give them assurances that we will remain in the area, but also safeguard, and some ideas of how to improve the safety of their neighborhoods by joining together with each other, watching out for each other, and banding together to ensure that people who would prey upon others, whether it be in burglaries or other crimes or nuisance activities, that the police department stands with them to repel that, and to have a standard of conduct in a neighborhood that assures people's sense of safety. And the trickiness here, and I'll close, Kevin, is that that's the balance. We can't put it all on shooting violence. We can't put it all just on homicides. Recognizing that the safety in this community, in this city of this size and of its complexities, is also involving human trafficking. It's also involving narcotic trafficking. It's also involving other crimes of involving property, as well as violence, domestic violence, and so forth. That we need to be able to address all of those. Doing so is a calculus that's continually changing and evolving. It's why our CompStat process, in my view, works so well, is because we're constantly managing what are our new and emerging threats, what's working, what's not working, and how do we adjust deployment, and how do we adjust our resources and strategies to deal with the evolution of what it means to have a safe community here in Los Angeles.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Our next question will be from Mr. Thomas. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, thanks, Chief. Thanks, guys. I just kind of following up on what you were talking about with the no bail issue. Do you, at this point, would you urge the LADA, George Gascon, to change that policy? Are you working with his office, and do you think that is in direct correlation with the fueling of the crime wave that we're seeing? And also, I don't know if you saw earlier, someone from the Police Protective League was talking about safety, and basically, I think it was on Fox News, he said he could not guarantee tourists their safety if they visited Los Angeles. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, Jamie Mcbride is a director for the Los Angeles Police Protective League, and as an advocate for the rank and file of the organization, his views represent, I believe, himself and perhaps the board. I believe tourists coming to Los Angeles are safe, certainly as safe here as in any other portion of the country. And yet there are challenges that we have here with this most recent event regarding the follow home or follow off for those wearing expensive jewelry and so forth. But those challenges exist in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. People coming here, I believe, the vast majority will come here and have a time of their life, and that's what we want people to understand. What we're identifying as far as risks are real, but I also think that in proportion, they're not like it's not out of control. It's not a spiral that we've lost control over. However, it is important that we not have a sense of acquiescing or just a lackadaisical approach to this. We're calling out the severity of it to bring everyone's eyes up on it, and have us committed to what's changed in the last 2 years, what has changed in the last 5 years. And just as the criminal justice system has evolved for the last 20 years, perhaps some of that evolution in the last 2 to 5 years is having some undesirable outcomes. And it's having some attributes that are being exploited by the criminal element, particularly the violent criminal element. And that's where I talk about zero bail and community supervision, and having consequences for those that are coming out of a prison setting, that they have to operate within the social norms, and if they don't, that they lose their right to be in a public setting. DA Gascon and I spoke just as recently as Friday. He's committed to holding, and he assured me that he will hold violent criminal offenders, accountable. His deputy district attorneys have a role at the time of arraignment. Every court appearance, they have a role in regards to pursuing from the court the continued incarceration of those that pose a serious risk to the safety of Angelenos. And I would ask and will have asked and will ask that in each instance that they pursue that. And he assured me that he was supportive of that. Additionally, the judges have the same role. And while I recognize the defense and their role in representing their client, and they may not agree or acquiesce to that, I do think the bench also has a role to recognize that in hearing from the people, and in seeing that even in the absence of hearing from the people, the prosecution looking at the circumstances at hand and exercising their discretion, so that a person who's carrying a gun, a loaded firearm in a public setting, and has prior acts of criminal violence or just criminality, that person be viewed as the serious risk that they are. And today, that's a zero bail offense. And so there are other offenses, including burglary, breaking into a home of an individual, which is, again, startling when you think about, many people say their home was robbed. It was actually burglarized. And we see at times the devastating impact it has with the loss of a life, or just a sense of one's safety being violated by a person smashing a window and entering a home day or night. And so what we're suggesting is that, again, we are always in a state of evolution of the criminal justice system, ebbing and flowing to the left, to the right, up and down. And right now, I believe that the efforts of the last year and a half or so in regards to COVID have created at least a perception of a more permissive environment. And for people that have the ability to go out and engage in the type of conduct we're talking about here with little or no consequence. And now in reality, we know otherwise. And that's where we want to remind the offender, and also remind the public that to the that these exceptions that we see right now of people walking, that how do we change that so people recognize that if they engage in anything I've talked about here, that they're not going to enjoy the freedoms that perhaps others that they've seen in the communities have. Last issue on that is supervision by probation and parole. With COVID, there's been a lot of supervision that's been done by telephone. And there's been also a hesitancy or resistance to violating a person on their terms and conditions of parole or probation for fear of the risk that poses that individual in a communal setting. The challenge with that is that those conditions are meant to safeguard communities from individuals who've had a habitual past of criminality. And so if we ignore when they violate those terms and allow them to continue to stay without housing, without a supportive environment, without adherence to societal norms, then individuals act on their own impulse, and they act on their own what they know. And this is what we've seen in people coming out of state prison and county jail with extensive criminal histories and no residence, no place in which they're calling their domicile. And they're ending up in homeless encampments and in other spaces, and they end up with firearms, they end up with narcotic trafficking, human trafficking, because they're resorting to the only resources or the only tools that they have. And that's a state and county responsibility, is to ensure that they have supervision, that they have the necessary resources, and that if those that can't work within those confines are not in a community setting.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Sir, do you have any last thoughts before we end our Zoom meeting?
Nope. I thank you, everyone, for your time and attention today. And we'll have more information, I expect, by tomorrow relative to the unfortunate and tragic murder of this young boy in Harbor, as well as our efforts to solve the double homicide in Southeast. Thank you all.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Have a great evening.